Hello, everyone. Ecosystem as a question sort of used to come up quite often in my mind, and I was always curious of understanding systems and how systems are designed. And that's how I was always fascinated by ecosystem, which was, I found it much more tactile and much more sort of human, and that's something sort of fascinated because it is complex. So understanding individuals, understanding ecosystems in many ways has some commonalities, and I think that's something which also I wanted to sort of put in perspective and share some of the work, especially as we all gather representing an ecosystem. So it's really started from understanding my discipline of research and how we sort of evolved, how we sort of came together. And I did all kinds of sort of work amongst understanding users, understanding product and systems, and even business models and business landscape. And in this sort of process, I also sort of built a bit more rigor in sort of interpreting research from a psychological, anthropological, and sociological point of view. And as I was trying to understand the discipline, it sort of brought in a lot of questions about how UX research sort of evolved. And it was important, at least for me, to understand our past in order to sort of try and sort of understand what the present times are and what could be the future. And that's when the sort of effort started on understanding, the history of UX research. It was the intent also of starting User Research India, which is sort of a non-profit, volunteer-driven organization to really help tech stakeholders understand the value of research. And that's how 2 years of work sort of came together, and I got a chance to publish a small mini book, which is the first sort of kind documentation on UX research and how it sort of evolved in India. And it's free and publicly available. So this was really an effort which started in 2021. It was quite an effort to sort of find all the evidence because there aren't any documentation available or accessible. And that sort of journey sort of led me to also understand and put in perspective how UX research evolved. And I think in some way I was able to sort of contextualize, and if I have to summarize it broadly, Indian trends and the technological evolution which sort of started from the 1950s to 60s sort of had a huge impact on how technology was getting adapted for users, for Indian users, and by Indian designers and researchers. So it was an interesting trend which coincided with HCI and how HCI sort of developed and evolved in Indian context. And in parallel, it was also market research, which was one of the first forms of research which came out in 1960s. And market research was also doing a lot of the ethnographic and qualitative research, which is now a part of UX research also. So these were broadly the three factors, but I will encourage you to sort of read this mini book and gain that sort of perspective and more importantly, the context of how it sort of evolved. And I think as we sort of, so URI is trying to sort of map the ecosystem in India, trying to understand what it is right now and where could it sort of go. So in order to understand the present, we sort of did a scraping on LinkedIn on looking at professionals who are hired as UX researchers, and we found 2,000 roughly researchers who are hired in India, especially in the product tech and agency space. So that was really the number which we were working with. And it also gave us an idea that, in many ways that, our ecosystem is currently at a nascent stage, which in many ways was what UX was in 2000 to 2010. And that sort of helped me to also put in perspective how UX sort of evolved. And I was trying to look at that. And of course, with my work in history of UX research, it also gave me some perspective on how sort of UX evolved in the ecosystem. And as you all know and also see that through your own experiences, that technology sort of evolved, and in that way, the interface design sort of came up, and that's something influenced the ecosystem, which is where the business started adopting, this need for interface design, hiring designers, and giving that sort of importance. And at the same time, and actually before that, academia was publishing a lot of research papers. They were sort of calling out what is the definition of design or UX, what is the scope of UX, where can it be applied, and a lot of this sort of volume of knowledge also turned into academic courses and skilling programs, which you see now at a very high sort of level. And at the same time, like UX Lighthouse, there are many sort of activities, communities, events which are happening, which really sort of brings the ecosystem together. And I think that's how we also are currently experiencing what our ecosystem looks like. And that sort of helped me also understand when, earlier times, UX was not considered as specialized skills. And when we were doing our research, we used to hear that often that engineers, especially in the 60s, 70s, up till 90s, were also designing interfaces, and they didn't feel the need for designers. And then it sort of moved on to sort of a specialized skill, and UX is recognized as a function, as an org, and the value has sort of been broadly recognized. But at the same time, in research, considering that it isn't at a nascent stage, it is still not considered a specialized skill. And the broader belief is that anyone can do research, anyone can talk to users, anyone can generate insights. So I think the question is, will this become a specialization? I don't have a direct answer, as you have heard in panel discussions and some of the presentations today. So I think that is something which we are trying to also understand and how it's sort of evolving. But as we sort of map the ecosystem and try and understand the gaps, we sort of looked at broadly some of the areas. One, and very foremost, is the lack of dedicated courses, specialized programs focused on user or UX research, to build that sort of rigor, to understand the benchmarking, to understand what more can you do. And I think there is a lot more scope which we see, and that's a huge gap. As much as in the industry, there are very few professionals who have the opportunity to side skill or upskill themselves, and I think that's another big challenge, and which is also leading to a talent asymmetry, which also was seen in the UX space also. The second is, of course, the business and organization maturity to be able to understand the value, to be able to see how it sort of can be leveraged to bring out the maximum ROI. There are many sort of challenges in how the research function is viewed, how it's structured within the organization. So that's another sort of gap which we recognize. And the last but not least is that this is a common question which is being asked a lot with researchers, that what is the value which we are delivering, what is the kind of impact which we have delivered. And I think that is something which has either not been clearly articulated or not been visible enough, and I think that's another area which we feel that the ecosystem needs to work on. And that really sort of also broadened to the idea of, what does ecosystem versus individual mean? And I think in the hope by the end of this talk that you understand that, how these sort of both work together. And really to understand the ecosystem, we need to understand the pillars. And this is broadly which we have sort of put together. One is, of course, the academia. Academia in many ways is a starting point, is a foundation, it's a safe space, it's a funded space to actually really go and explore further. So I think academia plays a very critical part, and that's something which we are trying to also sort of map and trace. The second is, of course, the changing landscape of technology and business. This will play a very critical part on how the ecosystem sort of evolves and adapts in the process. And third, of course, is the talent and the leadership. I think talent will play a huge part in sort of influencing the ecosystem, shaping the ecosystem, and of course, the decision makers, the leadership, playing their role also. And last but not least is, of course, the activities which we need to sort of build more momentum, build more visibility in order to also see a thriving ecosystem. So in terms of individuals, and I think I wanted to touch a little bit more about that. We see ourselves as different dimensions. We have not one, but we have many dimensions to ourselves. And just wanted to broadly cover some of these dimensions to recognize the patterns. One is that we constantly, in a professional context, seek industry skills. We constantly want to build our skills, and that's also an anxiety amongst many folks of being relevant, right? So I think industry skills plays a very critical part. The second, I believe that a lot of researchers and designers seek intellectual growth, and I think that's something which we are constantly looking for as opportunities, as experience to really push our intellectual capacity. And third, and not the least, and which is now becoming even more important with AI, that we are questioning a lot of things, and that's where we also seek to find inspiration, we seek to find meaning to what we do. And I think that also becomes a very important part of how we are shaped as individuals. So in some ways, just wanted to establish that individual and ecosystem has some very interesting sort of areas of symbiotic relationships. So as we seek sort of intellectual growth, we look at that growth in academia space, where we can really explore and create knowledge. And I think that that act of knowledge creation is very exciting. At the same time, we seek sectors or industry for experience, but also in how this knowledge can be applied. And I think very similar to what Shiva has talked about, is that as more and more we apply our sort of knowledge, more and more we learn and, importantly, unlearn. And of course, in the same way, the industry skills we are able to sort of apply and understand, and the same in find of inspiration and meaningfulness in the kind of activities which we conduct. So each of this sort of contributes to each other. None of them are in isolation. And it's important to sort of recognize that an ecosystem sort of allows you a lot of these aspects which are coming together. So as you sort of attend events, as you engage more and more people, it actually contributes not only to you as an individual, but it also gives back to the ecosystem. And I think that's where the idea of ecosystem and individual sort of can coexist, and we feel that individuals can coming together can really contribute to the ecosystem. And I wanted to touch upon a little bit more on that. So going forward, I mean, there are different ways of predicting future, but one of the ways of trying to understand what we can do as being part of an ecosystem, how could we sort of influence the ecosystem? And I think that's where something I wanted to sort of also cover from an ecosystem perspective. I think first is, from an academia, we do need new pedagogy, we need curriculums, we need more courses, and that's something which will really sort of provide that sort of momentum of bringing that talent funnel, which right now is actually a shortage in India. The second is that in technology and business, we have to continue to evolve, we have to adapt, and I think that sense of evolution and adaptation will also sort of influence how we can maintain and also grow the ecosystem. The talent and leadership is a lot about how we sort of grow this talent, we nurture this talent, and at the same time, we also sort of build that sense of maturity. And maturity doesn't mean as individuals, but also maturity in the ecosystem, maturity among stakeholders. And that's a lot of the work which I think ecosystem, or the kind of activities which we want to carry out, would shape that. And last but not the least, the activities. I think all these sort of activities, events, programs, all of this contributes to evangelization and engagement, and I think that is another piece which will really build the ecosystem. So really, it's about these 4 factors coming together where we see how an ecosystem can grow, and we continue to sort of evaluate our sort of framework and model of how ecosystem could evolve, especially in context of user research. So, as we talked about ecosystem and the pillars of it, there are also sectors within the ecosystem which we are currently mapping. And we sort of see a lot of value in that. So we already know about the product tech industry in terms of B2C and B2B. We also know a lot of agencies like the design thinking firms or innovation firms or research or design agencies. But apart from that, consulting is another space where there's a massive amount of hiring, especially at the time of recession and the research reckoning in 2022 and 23. So consulting is a very interesting space, like companies like Accenture, Cognizant, BCG, all of them have been hiring, so we see a lot of opportunity there. Another area is IT and software, which continues to sort of grow. There are consulting arms which are building their own in-house softwares. There are many other larger companies which are building their own softwares, and researchers are actually playing a very critical role to build that sort of depth and rigor in researching these products and the usability of these products. So that's another big area. But the area which I'm also very excited about is the nonprofit and the policy sort of space, and I think that's something which I also talked about earlier. I do think, finding that sort of inspiration and meaning for many of you could be found here. Nonprofit space, I must say, with my own experience, has not been easy to navigate, and it is sort of frustrating. But at the same time, when you see the kind of impact your work makes, I think it all comes together. And I think nonprofit space is more and more adopting technology, especially when they are involved in the final delivery, the final mile delivery of services and goods to every Indian. And they play a very critical part, and that's where the technology comes in, and the civic tech space, which is what it has been coined, where civil society and technology comes together to come up with solutions which impact billions of users. So I think there's a very different point of view, and I think the kind of research which you could explore in policy space and nonprofit space could be fascinating. I mean, just a month back, I was writing the policy brief for the first time in my life, and that was a great experience. And I think I encourage every researcher and designer to actually explore opportunities here through smaller projects, through volunteering, but make sure that you get paid even a small amount to see the value of your work. Another space which has been really underestimated, and I also underestimated, and we are in the process of also mapping this slowly, is central and state governments are actually hiring UX designers, product managers, and researchers. And that's fascinating. So you have NPS, you have NPCI, which looks at UPI payments. There are many other organizations who are hiring researchers and designers to actually look at some of these products which are impacting billions of Indians. So I think that's another opportunity which you should look out. I know that they are not advertised very openly, but if you build your contacts in the nonprofit space, you will also find leads within the government space to be hired. So that's another opportunity which I feel I'm excited about. And last, of course, and not the least, is that we are also trying to map the education sector and try and understand what are the current challenges and gaps which they are facing and what could be sort of unlocked for researchers. So in terms of individual and ecosystem, I wanted to sort of put together some key takeaways, and I think what we could do to actually contribute to the ecosystem. And I think to begin with is to just engage. The idea to engage with each other, especially like today what we are doing, is really to build collective intelligence around what we are doing, and then more importantly, why we are doing it. But I think that is something which also takes a lot of effort. I think turning up, showing up, engaging with people is also quite an effort. So I think it's a good starting point. And second is really to influence. We must take on the responsibility to influence within the organization, within a community, amongst businesses, to really understand the value, how the impact of research, what can be done better. And that will also in turn contribute to how could we raise the bar for research practice. I think that's another area which I think there's a lot to contribute by researchers and designers. And the third, and not the least, is to contribute. We have to contribute in many ways, and we can contribute actually in many ways by publishing papers, presenting case studies, being out there in the ecosystem, and more importantly, not just talk to other researchers and designers, but actually talk to tech stakeholders, talk to the tougher people who are not willing to see the value. And I think that's where the real impact will happen. And also to make sure that our contribution is consistent, because the more consistent we are, the more the ecosystem will become resilient and be able to sustain it. So I think that is another area which we feel we all can contribute as individuals, and that's really the ecosystem which is sort of combined. But I just wanted to sort of end it by saying that India is, as you hear all these days, that India is poised to sort of grow in the next 20, 30 years. You are going to see a lot of products which are being made for the global sort of audience, which I think is great, but we are also sitting on a goldmine of insights within a heterogeneous, complex, diverse society, which will also give us an idea of how we can sort of build products in future which are not sort of pushed for users to really learn and adapt on how they can engage, but rather the products which are designed for Indians, by Indians. And I think that's another piece which is something which we are still sort of learning, unlearning, because, giving a same example is that a lot of us assume that UPI has scaled and, has been used by millions of users. Yes, that's true, but there are many, many users who are actually dropping out of UPI, don't find UPI effective, they are constrained, they face further loss, are victims of fraud. And that means that there is much scope of delving deeper and understanding the nuances of what it takes to build a product for Indian. So I hope that all of you sort of look at this opportunity, especially in the Indian context, to unearth a lot of insights, and not just unearth insights, but actually use them and apply them to build products for billion users. Thank you so much.
Achyutha